Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of the WARF Essential Topics series. My name is Laura Heisler and I'm Director of Programming for WARF. And we are delighted to welcome you to join our esteemed panel of experts to talk about really important question as we face an unprecedented time of invention around the COVID-19 pandemic and working with coronavirus. Before we get into the meat of today's discussion, I want to mention a couple of housekeeping items for how this discussion will proceed. We're going to be hearing from our panelists and there'll be some vibrant conversation amongst them, but we'll also have a time for your questions towards the end of the session, and we're welcome to fielding your questions at any time. The way to ask a question is to use the Q&A function, which you can find by mousing over the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type in your question. You might see a typewritten answer come back, or your question might be teed up for a larger discussion with the group. I also want to mention that we are going to have a number of additional WARF Essential Topics sessions and entrepreneur sessions next month, and I'll be back at the end to tell you a little bit more about that. With that, I am delighted to turn the virtual podium over to my colleague, Justin Anderson, WARF's Senior Intellectual Property Manager, who'll be moderating today's discussion. Justin?
Thank you so very much, Laura. And good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for what we hope will be a very informative and thought-provoking discussion on the role of intellectual property in addressing the ongoing pandemic. Today's panel will touch on a range of issues, including how patents influence access to potentially life-saving discoveries, motivation for inventors, novel ways for providing access to technologies, and the not so obvious ways that IP protection can work for and against our shared interests as we work to address the ongoing pandemic. As the moderator, I have the honor of introducing our panel, which includes innovators, thought leaders, and IP experts. So without delay, I will introduce our panelists. First up, I'd like to introduce Kevin Noonan. Kevin is a partner with MBHB and serves as chair of the firm's Biotech and Pharmaceuticals Practice Group. Having spent more than 20 years working as a molecular biologist, he now represents pharmaceutical companies, both large and small, on a myriad of issues, as well as several universities in both patenting and licensing to outside entities. In addition, he is a frequent speaker on a variety of topics, including an appearance on 60 Minutes and the founding author of the Patent Docs weblog. Welcome, Kevin. Next, I'd like to introduce Jeanine Quinn. Jeanine is a patent attorney and leading commentator on patent law and innovation policy. He is the founder of IPWatchdog.com, serving as its president and CEO. In addition to shaping the debate on the impact of IP law on innovation and the economy, he advises inventors, entrepreneurs, and startup companies throughout the world. Welcome, Jeanine. Next up is David O'Connor. David is a professor in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at UW-Madison. The overarching goal of his lab is to make meaningful contributions to the global response to viral infections impacting human health. His lab studies the interplay of viral pathogenesis, host genomics, and immunity. Of note, he is a co-leader of CoVen, an international collaboration of investigators developing COVID-19 non-human primate models to test vaccines and medical countermeasures. More locally, David is collaborating with other UW researchers and a local startup to develop a scalable SARS-CoV-2 nucleic acid testing method that can be used for institutional level screening. Welcome, Dave. Next up is Lennon Rogers. Lennon is the director of the Granger Engineering Design Innovation Lab in UW-Madison's College of Engineering. Within the Innovation Lab, Lennon helps lead the UW Makerspace, an on-campus facility that allows designers and builders to leverage a variety of resources, including a wide range of rapid prototyping equipment. In response to COVID-19, he has facilitated a number of efforts by the UW Makerspace to assist with providing access to personal protective equipment. Welcome, Lennon. Next is Pilar Ossorio. Pilar is a professor of law and bioethics at UW-Madison and the ethics scholar in residence at the Morgridge Institute for Research. She also directs a research ethics consultation service for UW and affiliated research entities. She has served on numerous federal and international science policy advisory committees. Her research interests include governance of large-scale biosciences research, protections for people who participate in research, data sharing, ethics of big data science, and uses of race in research and medicine. Welcome, Pilar. And last but not least is my colleague, Janine Verma. Jeanine is the Senior Director of IP and Licensing at WARF, the Technology Transfer Office for UW-Madison. She has licensed a number of UW-Madison inventions to a variety of industrial partners across a range of fields, including biomedical engineering, medical imaging, and radiation therapy. In addition, she has developed a number of best practices and innovative approaches for commercializing university technologies. Welcome, Jeanine. Well, welcome you all again, and thank you so much for joining us. It's really an honor to host you all, and I really look forward to today's conversation. So to get things started, I'm going to turn to our two IP attorneys to start the conversation around IP's IP's role in bringing innovations to market. So Jean and Kevin, would you like to discuss?
Sure.
Go ahead, Gene. Why don't you take the first shot?
Okay. So the first thing I think to remember about IP and the role of patents in particular in the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic is we're going to be able to achieve a vaccine in record-breaking time, whenever that winds up occurring, because of the groundwork and the foundation that's been laid over a number of years, because of the vast amounts of research and development that has occurred and the tremendous amounts of money that have been spent by the private sector. Now, that's not to say that the federal government hasn't spent a tremendous amount of money themselves. The federal government has spent a great deal of money, and critical money, in fact, with universities such as the University of Wisconsin, engaging in basic research that then shows promise, that then winds up getting licensed and handed off to the private sector, that then engages in commercialization research, transitional research, and brings things to market. And they spend billions and billions of dollars of additional research. So there's been so much that has been learned over the last decade, several decades, that continues to make this faster and faster. Now, the role of patents and the role patents play is that in order to encourage that money coming in from the private sector, there needs to be some reasonable expectation of return on the investment. And that's where patents play a real, very significant role. And we see with Bayh-Dole, and this will be my last thought, and Kevin, I'll kick it over to you after this, is we know what the universe looks like without patent rights and without the ability to have exclusive rights in these types of inventions. Because prior to Bayh-Dole legislation passing in 1980, university technology just laid dormant and was not licensed. And since Bayh-Dole passed, there's been over 150 pharmaceuticals and vaccines, treatments to really horrible diseases, cancer treatments and the like, that have managed to make it to marketplace that otherwise would not make it to marketplace because the Byzantine regulations to take a license to university technologies. So by giving ownership of these patents to universities and making the acquisition of the rights much easier for corporations, that streamlines the whole process. And we see the fruits of the benefits of that. So patents have played a tremendous role in the ecosystem.
Thanks,
Kevin,
Gene.
yeah.
I agree with that. I think of it more as an ecosystem in the sense that Bayh-Dole is 40 years old this year. And I am not the person to give you the nuts and bolts of Bayh-Dole. John Soderstrom at Yale and Joe Allen, who was on Senator Bayh's staff, has, if you want to know Bayh-Dole, those are the two folks I would speak with. But I do know the effects from the beginning of the biotechnology revolution out at Stanford, all the way through the initials in the 70s to really an explosion in the 80s. When I was in graduate school, I knew a bunch of people who were starting biotech companies. And it was that opportunity to be able to get patents. Lincoln called patents, the genius fired by interest, or something like that. And the idea is you can actually, because you can protect your inventions, Bayh-Dole gave you the right to do that. It also meant you could have the collaborations that we've had between academia and pharmaceutical companies and others, of course. If you look at the 29 COVID vaccines that are in process now in phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials, and 138, and that's the last time I looked, that are in development, be surprised how many of those are a company like AstraZeneca and a company like Oxford University and a university like Oxford University. And time after time you see that, and it reflects the fact that there was that, interplay between them. If you look at Princeton, where I went to graduate school, one of the engineering buildings was paid for by Firestone. Why? Because they were doing research and there was that town and gown sort of interplay. Well, that's what's happened in the past 40 years with biotechnology and pharma. And so you actually have people who can do the blue sky research. And if you think about blue sky research, there was antisense RNA in the 80s, there was siRNA in the 90s, and there's CRISPR now, all of which were things that were developed by academic scientists looking at academic questions, not necessarily thinking at the time they got the answers about applications, but the fact that Bayh-Dole gave a pathway to protect the inventions, to be able to then have people like at the Tech Transfer Office at WARF to go out and license them, gave people the ability to think about the translation of the academic research to practical research. And the beauty of that for the rest of us is that we actually get things to come to market using people, the pharmaceutical companies, who know how to do that. So you don't reinvent the wheel. You have people who know how to think about new things, groundbreaking things, blue sky things, which is what universities do all the time, some of which are going to actually be practical. And you know what? The money the university gets for those things also then comes back and funds all the research about the guys running around, with nets trying to catch brand new species of butterflies. I think we need those guys too. I think we need that sort of unpractical, if you will, research, because all those things I mentioned, antisense RNA, CRISPR, siRNA, were all found by people who are not looking for something that could be used or useful. They were looking at basic biology and then came upon, aha, this is a way we can use this to a product or to get an ability to do something that they weren't thinking about at the beginning. But then, boom, when they found it, there was the avenue then to be able to think about it and get things that are quite useful for the rest of us.
Thank you, Jean and Kevin. That was a really great introduction to the topic. And one quick follow-up on that, I just want to reiterate, yes, Bayh-Dole, we're celebrating its 40th anniversary right now. And of course, it has enabled a number of great technologies to be translated off of campus. But one of the things we're seeing in the public press, and we hear continued calls for, is leveraging, maybe someone would say, the bitter aspect of Bayh-Dole, that being that the government could exercise so-called march-in rights to gain access to patented technology that was developed using federal funds. I think we're hearing this from a number of state attorneys general as it relates to remdesivir. Would either of you care to comment on that aspect, and are those calls misplaced?
Well,
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that.
Go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, Bayh-Dole doesn't allow for that kind of march-in right. And time and time again, the NIH has been asked to exercise march-in rights for that purpose. The march-in rights are there for the sole reason that if there's a drug that is not being developed at all, then the government has the right to come in and seize the rights and use that rights and make the drugs, for example. There's no right in Bayh-Dole to march in and take something that's important if somebody is making the drugs for widespread distribution. So a lot of people would like that to happen, and that would require a significant change to the law. There is no support for that in the law. And then the other thing to think about when you're doing that is the government, the argument goes like this: when the government has already paid for these drugs, that's fundamentally the argument. And that's fundamentally wrong, because what happens is the government provides seed money for what Kevin just referred to as the blue sky research. And the blue sky research is the type of research that no corporation could justify because it is too speculative. But universities are encouraged to do that kind of speculative, big thinking research, both to expand the horizons of the students and also to just look for wonderful things that they might be able to discover. Now, if they find something that is showing promise, at that point in time, then it becomes necessary to try and engage in transitional research and commercialization research, both of which are different types of research, to see if it can scale and to see if it can be made economically to go into the marketplace, and to see for drugs if it can go into the marketplace in a way where it will be useful and not hurt people. So there's so many different levels of research and extraordinarily expensive research that needs to be footed by private sector. So to say that the government has paid for these drugs is just simply not correct. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the economics of the drugs and the economics of buy dole.
But it's a great argument. It gets people thinking, and you're absolutely right. I would say that the other thing is, first of all, the government doesn't need buy dole, because there's an old World War II statute that gives the government the right to march in and to license anything that's patented because of an emergency, like this one. If you did have somebody who had the fear is someone will have a cure and they'll sit on it. That's never going to happen, but that's the fear. Government doesn't need buy dole for that, number one. And number two, to echo what Jean said, I think that I like to think simply. Remember when you were children, the little red hen, that story, right? The whole thing with the barnyard animals. Well, the government is the seed that they plant to grow the wheat. And everything else that happens that is actually translated tends to come from money from private industry, because those are the people who want to develop it, including the risky part, which is it can scale, it can do all those things, but then you have to get it approved. And we represented a company 20 years ago where there was the little applet on my computer, you watch stock prices. And I watched this company's stock prices the day that it found out that their number one lead compound, which was an antisense RNA that could cure cytomegalovirus infection in the eye, tanked in phase 3. And you could watch their stock price drop in real time. Okay. And so the fact being that the risk that has to be taken in these drugs, because I don't care how well they look, at the end of the day, you have to get past FDA. And if you can't get FDA to approve them, and I think that's a good idea, okay? I think that we shouldn't be guinea pigs for anybody, but I think that it's easy to throw money at a problem at the blue sky stage, right? It's harder when every dollar you spend has that possibility that it will come to nothing if it turns out that without any warning, it just doesn't work, or it does bad things to people that you can't accept. So I think that you have to look at how this is done in the real world, and people who say that the government's paid for it all they just like nice sound bites to get on 60 Minutes or something.
If I could just say one last thing, this is not to say that the industry hasn't had some, what I'll refer to as bad actors who have brought bad publicity to the industry. But as Kevin and we were talking about when we were discussing what we might want to talk about, is a lot of those quote unquote bad actors that have raised the price of drugs by 600, 700, 1,000% have been doing that with off-patent drugs, that they were the only ones that were making it. So they were able to do it not because of a patent, but because they were the only entity making that drug. Now, those people are creating bad publicity for the entire industry. And, people who aren't really knowledgeable about what's going on then think, oh, well, patents are evil. Well, there's no patents involved there. Right. And actually some doctors in the cancer area are finding it very difficult to get certain cancer drugs because they're off patent, and, they can't be made and charged enough for, and it's just not worthwhile and so forth. And so it's a much more complex issue. And the money, as Kevin said, that goes into this is not on the patent end. It's on all the other end, the research, the development, the testing,
commercialization.
Patents that fit on a bumper sticker, though. That's the problem.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for those thoughts. We really appreciate that, and that's a great way to kick things off. So now I'd like to turn to our two university researchers and get a sense from them as to what motivates you to invent. We've heard about the advantages that patent protection can offer and intellectual property rights with those assurances, as well as federal funding. But really, what is it that motivates you to seek to solve some of these challenging issues like that COVID has presented? So Dave or Lennon?
Sure. So I guess in the interest of stimulating a vigorous discussion, I'm someone who's a big evangelist for open science and the idea that science exists to support the public interest and to act in the service of society at large. And I think I would sort of take issue with the dichotomization that was presented in the first section between blue sky research and commercialization of research, because in the case of a drug like remdesivir, it isn't true that a university developed some idea, and then a company went and with its own resources went and developed and tested it, and then they're capitalizing exclusively on the fruits of the work that they themselves paid for. It's estimated that for remdesivir, at least $70 million of government funding went into the early stage testing of that drug specifically. And that's fine. I don't have a problem with with Gilead making profits on remdesivir, commiserate with the investment that they made in research and development and optimization and marketing and what have you. But I do think that to not acknowledge that the initial riskiest investment was borne by the government and that the government should recover that in large measure is sort of disingenuous. And I would further say that, you know, with some other aspects of the epidemic, as someone who is out there trying to figure out how we can improve testing and how we can improve the response to the epidemic and make it less bad, you can look at other examples such as N95 masks. There was a report on CBS Evening News last night that said that in Dodgeville, about an hour from here, there's one N95 mask given to a frontline healthcare worker every week. Every week, one mask. That is unconscionable. And the idea that the government shouldn't be able to step into that breach and provide enough N95 masks for every healthcare worker to be able to be safe simply doesn't mesh with the real world that I think as a researcher in the coronavirus space, you know, we work in. Now, that doesn't mean I'm against patents. It doesn't mean I'm against companies making a reasonable profit on their investments and on their research and development. But from my perspective, we sometimes make serendipitous discoveries in the process of trying to do our research. And that's a good point at which to, you know, work with WARF to make sure that the intellectual property on that is appropriately, managed. And I do it in part because, you know, as most of the people who train in my lab are not going to become university professors like me. And so understanding the role that intellectual property plays in the entire ecosystem of science is very, very important. But frankly, I think that in a crisis like this, a company like Gilead profiteering on a drug like remdesivir that received huge amounts of initial federal investment, to me, that's not right.
I mean, I guess I would ask, why do you think they're profiteering? I mean, what's the evidence then? And the other question is, why are the masks not available? I mean, did they say in that CBS News report why they weren't available?
Well, I mean, Lennon, I think maybe you can talk to this because you're more of a mask guy than I am.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. I could kind of talk about that. And I guess just a little bit going back to the question of just what motivates us to work on these projects and innovation and things like that. So typically I'm in the College of Engineering here, and we are teaching students to identify needs and design around those needs, work with users. And so when COVID kind of hit in March, it was somewhat of a straightforward scenario, is that normally we have to go out and look for those needs and try to identify it. It's a little difficult sometimes to really hit the need, but the hospital pretty much came to us. Kind of like when you say that mask situation, it makes me like, oh, that's totally is something that could be solved. But I guess in our case here is that the hospital approached us with the need for face shields back in March. I guess so the motivating factor there was just the need, and the need was very clear. And from an engineering perspective, it seemed pretty straightforward. I think one of the things in terms of IP, which was interesting in the case of face shields, but then kind of led to a whole bunch of other projects, which I could talk about, and there's like 10 other projects that aren't here, is the open source aspect of it. With the face shields, there were a lot of people a lot of companies. So Ford Motor Company's one, John Deere ended up getting involved, and actually about 300 other small to medium sized companies wanted to make face shields. This is back in March and April. But the barrier of IP and their fear of IP, according to what they told me, it was a barrier. So the fear of IP was a barrier. So by having our design open source seemed to help in general, and we saw a huge spread of the use of this, what we call the Badger Shield on my right here. But I think it had a lot to do with this open source aspect of it. As at least companies like Ford explicitly said it, that I think they could obviously create their own designs and things like that, but the fact that there was a design easily available that had a supply chain behind it, and I could talk more about that too, is that we helped set up the supply chain for the face shields, because that was another challenge. So kind of the open source design plus the supply chain, which the Wall Street Journal did an article about, because it is a really interesting topic about this thing called a pop-up supply chain that kind of occurred that seemed to be part of kind of the whole, what was driving our efforts with the face shields. And like I said, it kind of led to a bunch of other projects, which I could talk about, and some other interactions with companies where IP definitely came to play.
So I'm want to go back to the whole remdesivir and there being profiteers and all. You know, I just was checking to make sure I had my facts right before I said anything, but because I thought I was right. That was a drug that has a long history actually, and it was a failure at first. So I don't know how a drug that was developed and they tried to create it to treat Ebola, and it failed, and then they continued working on it, and now it's come back and it shows some promise for coronavirus. That suggests to me that a rather determined company in Gilead to try and make something work. It doesn't sound to me like a profiteer, and I really like to hear your evidence. I mean, because you called us, I think you said we were disingenuous, and you know that's sort of a personal attack. Now, if there's a way to you think that you have evidence that these pharmaceutical companies are profiteering, that's fine. But, you know, what I always hear is people say, look, it doesn't cost $10 billion to get out into the marketplace. Fine. You pick whatever number you want to pick. 10 billion, 1 billion, 500 million. It's a whole lot of money. It costs a whole lot of money to go from an idea to getting something out into the marketplace. The government money is a very small portion of that money, a very small portion. So you say $70 million by the government. I don't know for sure exactly how much went into remdesivir, but I would suspect, like every other drug in pharmaceutical, it was a very small portion of the overall money required to get it out into the marketplace. Now, the real risk is on the part of the private sector, you know, because the government has as its goal the forwarding of science and the teaching of students and the uplifting of the university. And you said you want to see that the government gets paid back. Well, that's the whole purpose of WARF. And the WARF is there to get the government paid back to reinvest in further inventions and discoveries. And WARF has been remarkably good at that over the years. I mean, there's a handful of technology transfer organizations that are do it well, and WARF does it probably as good, if not better, than everybody combined. I mean, there's Stanford, there's WARF, there's Columbia, and then there's pretty much like everybody else.
Sure. So what I was saying in terms of disingenuous is this dichotomization that there's blue sky research that gets done at the universities, and then that somehow goes into the companies, and then the companies are spending their own money to then bring the products to market without this de-risking that's provided by the government in the form of billions of dollars of subsidies to companies that help de-risk the early stage research. According to, you know, an article on the Washington Post, it was a minimum of $70 million in remdesivir that was funded from federal sources to bring it through for those trials that were done against Ebola, that were done against MERS. Much of those that early work against other diseases was federal funding. And then the reason I use the term profiteering was deliberate, because my understanding is that the Gilead price for it for Medicare and Medicaid recipients will be $3,120 for a 6-day course of the drug, for a drug that costs $6 US to manufacture for that same 6-day course.
I wouldn't believe those. I wouldn't believe those, because that's the $6, maybe the production cost, once you've gone through spending all the money showing that it was safe and effective and all that. So, I mean, when we start talking about numbers, especially when reporters start talking about numbers, it's easy to latch on to a statistic like that. But
sure, my point simply being that there is this gulf where the federal government is making a massive investment in research. You see it in the way that they have already pre-purchased vaccines from most of the leading manufacturers for billions of dollars, where the federal government is playing a major role in subsidizing a lot of this work. And I think that the taxpayers who are indirectly paying for that should recoup a reasonable fraction of that money on the backside if a product is successful, because it's the government who assumed a lot of that early stage high risk.
Yeah, but it's not just the early stage. But go ahead.
Could I break in here a little bit?
Yeah.
So I think it's a reasonable argument to say that maybe the government should get something back. I think, so you're saying $70 million of public investment into remdesivir. And, Jean was mentioning like a very low end estimate for average drug development is something like 500 million. And that's a very low end, right? So 70 million is a drop in the bucket, but say maybe it's a good idea to have that 70 million at least recouped by the government. We could do that, right? And we could do that having patents. In fact, we would do better if, continuing with the patent system that we have and just putting a little tax on those drugs, right? But we don't do that. And so I guess part of my question would be like, where does the responsibility lie? Part of the responsibility does lie with pharmaceutical companies and their choices about pricing, some of which have been, pretty outrageous. And I think, Kevin and Jean mentioned, some of that pretty outrageous pricing was done with drugs that were not on patent, right? Where literally you got 700% increases in the cost of a drug where the company that made that increase never invested a cent in the development of that drug. They just bought it, right? And it had been on the market for years. And then they instituted a 700% increase in the cost or in the price. So I guess if one of our questions here has to do with the connection of patents to pricing, there is some connection, but a lot of what goes on with pricing is, not as dependent on patents as you might think. And I can talk a little bit more about this later. But the other thing is, our government has some responsibility here. And if it's good public policy to recoup some of that investment, we could do that. We just haven't wanted to, right? There has not been the political will to do that. And someone in the chat asked, is there a situation where pharmaceutical companies have chosen to forego some profits? And of course, there is and are. So some companies have offered to give away, a certain number, like 1 million, 1 million doses of drugs related to, related to COVID if their drug comes to market. Likewise, I think that example of the government is prepaying for some products that might or might not come to market and essentially guaranteeing that if the product does come on the market, the government will buy 1 million doses. So that actually is a number for one of the vaccines. So that, again, doesn't, that's not so much affected by patents. That's something that the government is appropriately doing in emergency circumstances to incentivize this very fast production of new vaccines and drugs. And the public will get benefit from that, right? From that federal investment, because those drugs will be given at low cost or free to certain groups of people, right? Like possibly to healthcare providers in the first wave of distribution of the drug. So it's not that the public gets nothing from that. They do get something from that.
Thank you very much, Pilar. This has been a great spirited discussion, which we expected, and we're glad to see. I think one thing, just kind of stepping back and going off of one of Jean's comments, to note really this, careful balance of interests in this circumstance, as well as when, public health is on the line. I'd like to ask Jeanine, really, how does WARF approach, its obligations in, protecting intellectual property for University of Wisconsin research, with the need to I guess encourage access to these types of technologies? Are there mechanisms by which we're investigating making licensing of these technologies easier?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And Jean and Kevin did a great job really kind of teeing up what I was hoping to say today. WARF works to protect the intellectual property created at UW-Madison to help foster the development of new products based on the research that happens here on campus. And it's been, described and known that patent protection historically increases the potential for the commercialization of new life-saving technologies, not hinder it. And that, it's really crucial to translating university inventions into the marketplace because of the amount of research that needs to happen within a company setting after we're translating it from the university research lab into the company. And really, as unprecedented as our current events seem, we have long established best practices in university tech transfer that anticipated a lot of the challenges that are posed by a global pandemic. Jean and Kevin referenced the Bayh-Dole Act. We also have a 9 points in licensing that really establish how we work to provide technology to the benefit of the public. So we work to establish relationships and contracts with industry to help ensure the timely development of commercialization of technologies. We work to provide broad access to technologies such as research tools, and really strive to construct license arrangements that help ensure either low or no cost access to medical innovations for populations in need. And so these were really, these are foundational best practices that we as a tech transfer organization have, tried to work through for many, many years. And in April, our Association of University Technology Managers provided licensing guidelines for university tech transfer offices to use when considering licensing COVID-19 related technologies, and we're signed on to these guidelines. They're really a clear extension of our core values, which provide for the broad distribution of public health solutions. And these strategies are meant to facilitate a rapid response by potential licensees to make COVID-19 technologies a top priority for them and for our organizations as we're identifying the research that's happening on our campuses that are really available to the prevention, treatment of COVID-19 and protection of the healthcare workers. So for most technologies, the strategy is accomplished by adopting a time-limited, non-exclusive, royalty-free license in exchange for the company really committing to try to make something rapid and make it distributable in the next 6 to 12 months for PPE technologies, and looking to find ways that companies can accelerate their development of technologies that can help during the pandemic. There's potential for these licenses to convert to a more typical licensing structure after the pandemic if appropriate. And after reviewing these guidelines, we were signed on to them. We created a license template for this non-exclusive royalty-free agreement. And then we actually shared it with over 30 of our university colleagues. So that way people had examples of license deals that they could use. We currently have 2 PPE technologies and a diagnostic assay sample prep technology in our pipeline that could utilize the COVID-19 license guidelines. We appreciate that not all of the technologies will be able to be licensed under this non-exclusive structure, especially as you're speaking to therapies or diagnostics for COVID-19. For all of the risks that have already been discussed and the amount of money that goes into developing those technologies, really the best and most efficient way to get those technologies into the public is probably through an exclusive license. And we've had university colleagues reach out and talk about their difficulties in trying to provide technologies like that on a non-exclusive manner because the companies that want to license them need exclusivity because of the risk and the capital that goes into developing it. So, through utilizing these COVID-19 guidelines, we're really trying to further incentivize the commercialization of COVID-19 related products. And we're still patenting and protecting the innovations coming off our campus because it's really well understood that patents and the exclusivity that they provide are still needed to drive innovations, to drive markets, to drive commercialization. And that's important to the success of the technologies during and after the pandemic. And further, our patenting and licensing activities really are core to our mission of supporting UW-Madison through moving the innovations to the commercial market and then providing that research support back to campus and having a global impact.
Jeanine, I have a question.
Yeah.
One of the things that people think about with patenting and licensing is it gives companies a right to do something, but it also gives you a right to say what they can't do. Mm-hmm. So let's take this hoarding or not bringing to market, not doing things in the public interest. Does this license that you have provisions where if somebody tried to do that, their license would be canceled and they wouldn't be able to do that?
Yep. Yeah. Requirements of the license are to develop the technology, as you said. Like that's what we want to see happen in all of our technology licenses, but even more specifically here in this situation, because of the urgency that's associated with those technologies, is that it's not to just take them in and sit on it. We're giving you this access to the technology on a royalty-free basis because you're committing to do this in a timely fashion and you're committing to a development plan that brings something to market quickly. So, that's what we're willing to give in order to get that fast turnaround.
Could I ask a question? So there have been people who have proposed that we go further than that, and that we include in licenses that are where we're licensing university developed products or inventions, that we include provisions that are sort of like a reach through, in a sense that it would require the licensee to make this product available at lower prices in less developed countries or in healthcare systems that serve a high proportion of people in poverty in the United States, for instance. Have you ever done anything like that or thought about doing anything like that?
That's that kind of the humanitarian use is definitely something that we've included in agreements that relate to therapeutics or therapeutic devices. In our COVID-19 license, we do have kind of a restriction on profitability that they have. And, it really is a kind of a case-by-case basis, but definitely something that we have done, universities do, to try to make technology and therapies more available to people in need. That if you're going to have some, unfortunately, I'm going to use the word pricing, if you're going to have some of the pricing flexibility in the more developed nations, that you're using that to then benefit the other developing countries.
Well, thank you very much, Janine, and thank you all for your questions on that. I'm just going to go back to Pilar here for a second and just help me understand. I think as a IP professional myself, I have some inherent biases, but can you maybe help us unpack these issues around whether or not, patenting pandemic-related inventions is more problematic than patenting any type of invention? And, as we're seeing kind of public concerns bubble up here and make their way to, the popular press, are they well-founded or are they misplaced in any way?
Well, so first of all, I think what has already come out is that there are kind of standard ethical critiques of patenting any medical invention. And those critiques tend to revolve around the impact of patents on access to important medical products. So having a patent often, but not always, permits the holder to charge more for a product covered by the patent than they could charge in a fully competitive market. So that's called supra-competitive pricing. And if the patent holder is able to and does charge those high prices, then the product is less available to people who need it. That can exacerbate inequality, right? Because people who have enough money or who have good enough healthcare typically can get it, and other people might not be able to get it. So the first thing I need to say about this is that, access to medicines always matters, whether you're in a pandemic or not. But in a pandemic, the issue perhaps matters even more. First, because the amount of sickness, suffering, death is insupportably high. It's not only negatively affecting individuals and their immediate family and friends, but at some point, that widespread and high level of suffering affects the entire society. And so there's not only individual good in making sure that people have access to medicines, but there is actually social good in doing that during a pandemic. Secondly, treating an infectious disease such as the SARS-CoV that causes COVID can help individuals, but it might also help other people, right? So part of the idea of vaccination is that we may prevent the spread of that, of the virus to other people. And so you're treating both the individual who now you're preventing that person from getting sick, but you're also preventing other people from getting sick. So again, there's a social good associated with these pandemic-related products that is maybe greater than we usually confront in ordinary circumstances, where it still matters, of course, ethically, whether people have access to medicines, but it maybe even matters more in a pandemic. So that said, I think my personal position is that, having a patent can permit companies in some circumstances to charge super competitive prices, but they don't have to, right? And I think some of the things that Janine was saying, right, suggests that there are all kinds of ways of using patents to actually help promote social good. And the other thing is, it's just not always possible to charge super competitive prices, even if you have patents. So think about all the vaccines that are in development against the novel coronavirus that causes COVID. We heard, I forget, there are over 100 that are in development, there are at least 4 that in this country are in late phase clinical trials and could come on the market within the next year or less. So, within a couple of years, we might have 4 or more vaccines on the market, all sort of targeting the same group of people. And, that's a competitive market, even though all those vaccines, I'm sure, are patented, right? Or they're covered by a variety of patents potentially. So it's not always the case that having a patent allows a company to charge super competitive prices. And even when the company is in a position where that can occur, it doesn't mean it has to occur. And, I guess I would just go back to some things that I said earlier, which is the companies have responsibilities. And I think many of them are really trying to step up, but other entities here have responsibilities too, right? And I would say our political leaders have a lot of responsibilities to try and make sure that pricing doesn't get out of control. I mean, drug pricing in this country is really problematic, both on the end of patented drugs in some cases, but as we've talked about, also sort of at the other end of the spectrum with these unpatented generic drugs, where the pricing is too low and it leads to problems. This country has sort of had notorious political failure in addressing problems of drug prices. And in this emergency, we're getting some leadership that might help somewhat. And I actually think there is there's certainly willingness within many of the companies to negotiate around the pricing structure. I've also seen, articles from economists that talk about the fact that it's incredibly hard for them to even try and figure out how COVID-related products should be priced. So I just think the nexus between patents and pricing, it's there, and it's there intentionally, right? Like that's how patents create an incentive for people in the private sector to invest in innovation, is because it dangles out this possibility that you can charge super competitive pricing and recoup your investment. But that nexus is not all that tight, right? And there are, you know, patents may provide one set of opportunities for companies that want to behave badly to do that, but they have a lot of opportunities to behave badly and they don't need patents to do it. And on the flip side, sometimes having patents can help, you know, by being able to license in innovative ways, the patent holder might actually sort of improve the cause of justice in some way, or improve accessibility to medicines. And I guess the very last thing I would say is that this whole question of public investment, so it's often framed as a kind of ethical argument that there is an unjust double dipping in a sense by the companies because the public paid for an early investment in the discovery phase of something that later gets turned, an invention that later gets turned into a drug and goes to market. So the public pays part of that development of the drug and then pays again when people are paying super competitive prices, right? And so the argument is framed as a kind of ethical unfairness. I guess I am more aligned with Kevin and Jean in thinking that the government's investment is, you know, the smallest part of what it costs to get an actual approved drug to market. But also it's not clear to me that that's double dipping or inappropriate in the sense that shouldn't it be a function of the government to be, you know, sort of sparking that kind of early phase innovation, generating new knowledge at that very, you know, sort of fundamental level. And we want that knowledge in part because we want companies to pick up that knowledge and develop it into drugs. We could have a completely different economic model for developing drugs, but we don't. We have the economic model where they're developed in the private sector. So I guess to me, it doesn't look like double dipping necessarily. It just looks like, you know, like our society has abdicated any responsibility for doing anything that controls the price of drugs. So sometimes the price is too high, whether it's a patented drug or it's a generic drug. And there are things we could do about that if we had the political will to do it, and we haven't done those things.
Can I jump in here for 1 sec? Because, you know, it's a very interesting conversation, particularly when you start talking about the ethics of the drug pricing and so forth, because there's two ways to really look at this, right? You know, is it ethical to prevent people who can't afford, people who are impoverished or people who are in, you know, third world countries from getting the drug today because they can't afford it? You know, if you frame the question like that, it leads you to a certain answer. But if you frame the question as that eventually, usually in about 10 or 12 years, that this drug is going to be generic. And I always, when I teach this to students, it's like, whenever you feel the worst and you go to the pharmacy, that's when the pills are going to cost the least, right? Because you're taking generics that are off, usually, you know, antibiotics that are been around for a very long time, you know? And there's a statistic that I always like throwing into the conversation and give this, you know, some real meat. Every year since 1977, the World Health Organization has come out with a list of what they consider the essential medicines that people need to have or should have access to. 95% of them are off patent. So let's remember that these off patent drugs are off patent forever. You know, so once you get past the whatever inequalities or whatever unfairness there is for the period of time that the patent is in force, which we can and should talk about, then it's going to be much reduced, except for the Martin Shrillicks of the world, who then go out and do really bizarre things. And I think he's in jail now for having done what he did, and he probably should be in jail for that, right? You know, and but that's where this conversation needs to go to, I think. And obviously we're going to run out of time, but this is a long stage conversation. Then the other thing that I think we have to also factor in is, we're talking about, however many millions, 50, 100 million, 70 million in the case of remdesivir. I have no reason to doubt that the government puts in and then the company runs with it. Well, let's just say that happened. Well, that would also frequently happen with drugs that companies go and run with, and then they don't ever make it to market. Because if you look at the statistics, it's something like 10% of drugs are blockbusters where they make a lot of money. 70% they lose their shirt on, and 20% they make a little bit less than what they spent or a little bit more than what they spent. So they're really got to pay for the 70% where they lose everything with the 10% where they make a lot of money. And the economics are extraordinarily complex. And, and this is where organizations like WARF have to come in, because they have a public goal in mind as put forth in by Dole. Is their goal is not necessarily to maximize returns back to the university, as odd as that sounds. The government tells them, hey, your goal is to put this out into the stream of commerce to help society. And on top of that, your goal is also to help small businesses. So you have a small business preference, so that then, because that's where you get job creation. So there's this whole ecosystem around Buy Dole and innovation and helping society and helping create jobs that the government seeds the money with, that is an extra layer of complexity in the economics that we're talking about.
And benefit.
So I
And
totally
benefit.
agree with that. And I wanted to pick up though something that somebody put in the question session, because it was something I meant to say and forgot, which is that I think one of the things that people mistakenly believe is that getting patents undermines open science, or that intellectual property in general undermines open science. And that's not correct. If you think about, sort of open source licenses, the reason that we have open source licenses is because there's copyright on, say, some software. And so somebody has something to license, right? And partly by using open source licenses, you can stop other people from taking your software and then privatizing it, right, later. And similarly with patents, there's nothing inherent about a patent except that you have to file before you make a lot of disclosures, or that might preclude you from getting a patent, right? But as long as you file an application, people can share all kinds of information about that invention and products covered by the patent. And not only that, the whole public purpose of a patent is in part to make sure that people disclose something about how to make and use that invention, so that in part, when the patent expires, as we were talking about, other people will be able to do that. Now, we can argue about how effectively the disclosure function of patents has been carried out over the last decade or two. There are many critiques that it's not good enough, right? But I would say that actually the idea of public disclosure is built into the patent system. And there's nothing about patents that sort of precludes open science and sharing of data and materials. And by the way, a person can have a patent and choose not to enforce it, right? Like, there are times when you might permit people to infringe your patent. Companies do that with each other sometimes. Universities do that sometimes. Companies do that with universities. So, and you don't lose a patent just because you choose not to enforce it. I guess the last thing I would say, just want to go back to something Jean said, which is exactly right. Drugs come off patent and then they're available, hopefully forever, although it sometimes, like I said, there's a bit of a market failure there because people stop wanting to make them. And so we go into shortages because they're too cheap. But this is where in a pandemic, it matters, because we don't have 10 years to wait for those things to go off patent, right? So this is why I think having, special policies related to the pandemic are justified in part because we can't wait.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that's a great place to end with this notion of policy. And the fact that we have an election coming up here in a couple short weeks. So make your voices heard. And I really, really want to extend my, thanks to all the panelists, to all the attendees. Sorry we weren't able to get to all your questions, but I think the conversation was really rich and fulfilling. I hope everyone took something away from it. If you have any questions, feel free to email them to us, reach out to WARF, and we can pass them on and hopefully get back to you. Thanks again, and I want to hand it back to Laura Heisler.
Thanks so much, Justin, and it really was a great discussion. I want to just mention that we recorded this session, and you can find a link to the recording at warf.org underneath our program section, or at discovery.wisc.edu under our videos. And to let you know that we'll be reaching out to let you know about some sessions coming up in November. And thanks again, Justin, and the entire panel for a really important discussion. Thanks, everybody. Be well and stay safe.
Thanks, Laura. Bye, everybody.